There is an island in the Mediterranean where history starts in the wrong direction. Temples appear 2,000 years before the people who were supposed to build them. And the bones once unearthed to explain that contradiction vanished without a trace. If what you are about to hear is true, then the entire prehistoric timeline of the Mediterranean will need to be rewritten from the ground up. Because beneath Malta lie three details that official history tried to erase until they began resurfacing on their own. There are places on Earth where history feels complete, where the line from past to present is smooth and continuous. Malta is not one of those places. On this small limestone island in the central Mediterranean, the story of humanity does not begin at the beginning. It begins in the middle. It feels as though someone opened a book, tore out the first chapters, and left the rest for us to guess at. What remains is a landscape filled with structures older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than any known civilization in Europe, yet surrounded by a silence so deep it distorts the entire timeline of the ancient world. To walk across Malta is to feel a contradiction under your feet. The stones lying in the sun carry the weight of tens of thousands of years, yet the people who are supposed to have built them appear in the archaeological record only a few thousand years before the Bronze Age. According to textbooks, the first settlers arrived around 5900 BCE, simple farmers travelling by boat from Sicily. But the temples they are credited with creating do not resemble the architecture of Sicily or of any Mediterranean culture, or even of the broader Neolithic world. The structures rise suddenly, with no prototypes, no failed attempts, no gradual evolution of design. They emerge into existence already perfect, already complex, already aligned to celestial patterns that require generations of observation. It is this silence before the appearance of mastery that forms the first fracture in Malta's story. Cultures do not begin with perfection. They climb toward it through centuries of trial and error, through mistakes left buried beneath the more successful layers above. Here, the middle is all that exists. The beginning has vanished. When early explorers and scholars tried to explain this contradiction, they did not turn to science or archaeology. They turned to myth. They spoke of a time when Malta belonged to beings larger and stronger than the humans who live here now. They told stories of a giantess who carried stones across the island as though they weighed nothing, placing them into position with a craftsmanship that ordinary people could not understand. At first glance, these tales sound like folklore, but myths do not survive for thousands of years unless they are built on some foundation of memory, however blurred or symbolic. Even in modern Malta, the presence of something older lingers in the air. The sun sets differently over these stones, the nights sink deeper, and the island seems to remember something its written record does not. Visitors often speak of a strange heaviness that settles over them as they approach the ancient temple sites, a silence that does not feel natural, a stillness that waits for a question no one knows how to ask. It is as if the landscape itself is holding its breath, reluctant to reveal what it once witnessed. Archaeologists have tried to fill in the gaps, but the more they study, the stranger the picture becomes. The temples show precision that does not match the tools available at the time. Their curves and chambers indicate geometric planning, astronomical alignment, and social organization at a scale far beyond what a small island population should have been capable of. Yet the builders appear suddenly, then vanish with equal abruptness, leaving behind no signs of a long developmental arc and no continuation of their knowledge in later cultures. This absence is not normal. Cultures evolve, expand, share, adapt. But here, the knowledge seems isolated, sealed within a narrow window of time with no before and no after. It is like finding the ruins of a cathedral in the middle of a barren plain, with no trace of the town that built it. Something is missing, not in the stones, but in the story. As one moves from site to site, Gantija, Menashdra, Hagar Kim, the feeling deepens. The stones are too large, the chambers too precise, the doorways too tall, the wear on the floors too heavy. Nothing fits comfortably into the accepted narrative of a small Neolithic island community. Yet the official explanations remain unchanged. The temples are attributed to the earliest known inhabitants, and their sophistication is labelled as an impressive but isolated achievement. But the cracks in this explanation widen the more closely one looks. Why is there no trace of the gradual learning process every culture goes through before achieving monumental architecture? Why are the earliest structures also the most advanced? Why do the surrounding islands show no similar development? Why does Malta stand alone in its level of refinement and ambition? And why does the island seem to hide the very clues that could resolve these questions? There is an unease that settles in when a culture appears too early and too perfect. It suggests either a missing chapter or a forgotten predecessor. It suggests that what we call the beginning is not the beginning at all, but the remnant of something older, something erased, something replaced by a more convenient narrative. Malta's history does not resist explanation because it is incomplete. It resists explanation because someone at some point wrote over it. The question is not only who built the first temples, but who built the world the first settlers found when they arrived, and why that earlier world left so little behind, except stone. For centuries, the island has whispered the same quiet contradiction. The timeline does not match the architecture. The architecture does not match the tools. The tools do not match the people. And the people do not match the myth. The result is a story suspended in the middle, anchored to a foundation that no longer exists. But within this contradiction lies the thread that leads downward, into the places where Malta's surface is no longer enough to hold its secrets. The temples above ground are extraordinary, yet they are only the first shadow cast by something deeper. Because beneath Malta lies an underworld carved into the limestone, an underground labyrinth where the silence becomes heavier, the contradictions sharper, and the mysteries far older than anything on the surface. And it is there in the depths that the real story begins. When the first megalithic temples emerge around 3600 BCE, they appear with a level of complexity that should have required generations of experimentation. The curves of the chambers are smooth and deliberate. The stone blocks weigh several tons, arranged with precision that suggests an understanding of stress, balance, and geometry. Some chambers align with solstices or equinoxes, indicating long-term observation of the sky. Others feature intricate interior designs that would have demanded planning, coordination, and architectural skill far beyond what small island communities are expected to achieve. Yet there are no earlier phases, no crude attempts, no half-built prototypes, no variations indicating a search for form. The earlier structures are already advanced, they are complete. The idea that they belong to the first Neolithic inhabitants forces a contradiction. How does a newly arrived population acquire knowledge they have not had time to develop? And why do later generations show no continuation of this architectural tradition? Archaeologists describe Malta's temple culture as unique. That word, however, does not capture the problem. Unique implies difference. This is something else entirely. The megalithic builders did not follow the developmental patterns of any surrounding region. They did not imitate Sicilian styles. They did not borrow from North Africa. They did not reflect the practices of the Eastern Mediterranean. Their designs rise from nowhere, share no lineage, and vanish without descendants. The absence of development is not subtle, it is stark. For a culture to begin at its peak and then decline without clear cause is unusual. For it to begin at its peak without any signs of how it reached that peak is unprecedented. To understand how strange this is, one can look at other megalithic traditions. Stonehenge evolved across centuries, shifting in layout, material, and scale. The pyramids of Egypt developed from mastabas, step pyramids, and experimental phases that reveal a long learning curve. Even early Anatolian sites show an arc of development from simple enclosures to complex ritual spaces. But Malta does not show an arc. It shows a point, a single brilliant point of achievement surrounded by silence. This silence becomes even more puzzling when considering the logistics required to build the temples. The island's resources were limited. Timber for large-scale construction was scarce. Metal tools were not yet available. The population, based on remains and settlement evidence, was not large enough to support massive labour forces. Yet the builders erected some of the largest freestanding stone structures in the world. They transported blocks weighing more than many modern construction machines can manage. They carved chambers with surfaces so smooth they resemble work done with tools far more advanced than stone. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. Either the population was far larger than expected, or the techniques used to shape and move the stones were far more efficient than the archaeological record can explain. In either case, the narrative of a small Neolithic community working with simple tools begins to strain under the weight of the evidence. The temples themselves add to the confusion. Their internal designs suggest symbolic or cosmological functions that require deep cultural cohesion. The presence of altars, apses, and acoustic features indicate ritual practices that must have evolved over time. But again, there is no earlier record of these practices. Nothing in the first centuries of settlement hints at a population preparing to build complex ritual centers. It is as if the cultural foundation for the temples was inherited rather than invented. Some researchers propose that earlier phases simply eroded or remain undiscovered. While possible, such explanations become less convincing when considering the consistency of the problem. Missing transitional architecture is one thing. Missing evidence for all foundational stages of a complex society is another. The absence across multiple categories suggests not natural loss, but a deeper structural gap. A few scholars have suggested that the builders might not have originated on Malta. Perhaps they came with knowledge already formed. Yet this idea raises its own questions. If a skilled culture migrated to the island, why is there no sign of their presence elsewhere? If they possessed advanced techniques, why did those techniques not spread across the Mediterranean? Why is their influence absent in the regions from which they supposedly came? These questions do not point toward an answer. They point toward an anomaly. And anomalies tend to invite explanations that the academic world would rather avoid. Some have speculated about a lost maritime culture predating the known Neolithic world. Others have proposed that rising sea levels may have erased the earliest phases of Malta's past. The island would have looked very different before the end of the last glacial period. Land bridges may have connected it to larger territories. If settlements existed on now submerged coastlines, their remains might lie deep under the Mediterranean, beyond easy investigation. But speculation only highlights the central issue. We do not know who built the earliest temples. We do not know where they came from. And we do not know why their architectural knowledge appears suddenly and disappears just as quickly. What we do know is that Malta's megalithic builders behaved unlike any other known Neolithic community. Their structures are deliberate, coordinated, and exact. They are not experiments, they are conclusions, and they stand as monuments to a cultural memory that did not survive in any written form. For thousands of years, the island's inhabitants have tried to explain this mystery in the only way they could. Not with data, but with stories. Not with theories, but with memory. Ancient villagers pointed toward the massive stones and answered with a simplicity that belied the seriousness of the claim. They said the giants built them. Modern archaeology rejects the idea for obvious reasons, but rejection does not erase the origin of the story. And that story continues to echo across Malta, resurfacing wherever the evidence fails to align with the official narrative. The temples appear fully formed because the knowledge behind them did not begin on Malta. It began somewhere else, somewhere older, somewhere the island's first settlers may have only dimly remembered. And it is within that memory that the next chapter of Malta's mystery takes shape, because the people themselves insisted on telling us who built the stones. They said the builders were giants. One of the central figures in these oral traditions is a giantess known as Sansuna. Her name appears in variations across villages, each version carrying the same essential memory. She was tall beyond human measure and strong enough to lift the megaliths that ordinary people could not budge. According to local accounts, she carried stones on her shoulders as easily as others might carry baskets of grain. She placed them gently on top of one another, guiding them into position with a precision that requires more than strength. It requires knowledge. It requires intention. In some stories, Sansuna did not work alone. She belonged to a race of beings who lived on Malta long before the arrival of the island's first agricultural settlers. These beings were described not as gods, but as people, albeit people of extraordinary size. Their presence, according to the old accounts, shaped the landscape. Their movements carved paths. Their hands arranged the stones. And their final disappearance left the island's later inhabitants with a world too large for them, a world they could not replicate or fully understand. What distinguishes Malta's giant traditions from typical folklore is their tone. Many cultures have stories of giants, but these tales often sit firmly in the realm of myth. They involve heroic exaggeration, supernatural feats, or symbolic narratives about creation. Malta's stories do not. They describe giants not as magical beings, but as earlier inhabitants. They speak of their routines, their dwellings, even their food. One common detail says that Sansuna ate broad beans while she worked, a strangely mundane image for a figure of myth. It is the kind of detail that suggests memory, not metaphor. Folklorists have long noted that when a story retains ordinary details about extraordinary beings, it may reflect a distant, distorted recollection of real events or people. This does not prove the existence of giants, but it does raise the question of why such stories persist so consistently in regions associated with megalithic architecture. Malta is not alone in linking large stone structures to large people. Sardinia has its tales of giant tombs. The Balearic Islands speak of stone lifters. The Levant has accounts of peoples of great stature associated with fortified cities far older than historical records allow. Across the ancient world, wherever megaliths rise from the landscape, stories of giant builders tend to follow. This pattern is not easily dismissed. Independent cultures separated by geography and language tend to generate different mythic traditions. Yet the consistency here suggests something deeper than coincidence. It suggests a shared memory across ancient communities, a recognition that the people who built the earliest monumental structures were physically different, or at least perceived as different, from those who inherited them. The architecture of Malta itself encourages this perception. The doorways of several temples are unusually tall, much higher than necessary for average Neolithic individuals. The altars and raised platforms stand at heights awkward for smaller people, more suitable for someone with longer limbs or greater reach. The wear on the floors suggests heavy footfall, not the light steps of a typical human population. These observations are not conclusions, but they are clues. They hint at the possibility that the oral traditions do not exaggerate the past, but compress it into a form small enough to be spoken aloud. The idea that a population of larger-bodied people once lived on Malta may be uncomfortable for modern scholarship, but discomfort does not erase the questions. And these questions deepen when considering the abruptness of the temple culture's disappearance. If the builders were simply Neolithic settlers, their architectural knowledge should have persisted. Their techniques should have influenced later Mediterranean communities. Instead, the knowledge vanishes. The island's later inhabitants never replicated the megalithic structures. They lived among them, but could not reproduce them. They inherited stone they did not understand. One might imagine that if a group of unusually tall, unusually strong individuals lived here, they may have existed in small numbers. They may have been the last of a lineage that thrived before rising seas isolated the island. And if they dwindled, leaving only memories behind, it becomes easier to see how the later population created stories to explain structures too large to belong to them. The myth of Sansuna might be the final echo of a people whose bodies and knowledge were out of proportion with the world that came after them. If these stories were isolated to a single village or told in a single generation, they could be dismissed as local fiction. But they are not. They extend across Malta, reaching back centuries. Early ethnographers noted that villagers spoke of the giants not with embarrassment, but with certainty. When asked who built the megaliths, they answered simply and directly. The giants built them. There was no debate, no alternative theory, no hesitation, as though they were repeating something once known but half forgotten. It is possible that these stories preserve the cultural shock experienced by the first settlers when they reached Malta. They found an island already shaped by someone else. They found structures too large to belong to them and too old to fit their understanding of the world. In the absence of an explanation, they may have concluded that the builders were giants. Over time, memory hardened into story, and story into tradition. Yet something in the tone of the oldest accounts suggests more than imagination. It suggests recognition. Ordinary humans tend to explain the extraordinary through myth, but they tend to explain the unfamiliar through description. Malta's giant traditions feel like descriptions. They describe the builders as larger, stronger, and earlier than the people now living on the island. They present a population unlike the Neolithic farmers, yet intimately tied to the stones that dominate the landscape. If the oral traditions reflect even a fragment of truth, then the identity of Malta's first builders becomes far more complicated. They may have belonged to a lineage now lost, a population whose physical traits led later generations to remember them as giants. And if so, the stones they left behind may not simply represent architectural skill, but the final traces of a people who lived at a scale the modern world has forgotten. The question then shifts from whether giants existed to what kind of beings the early inhabitants actually encountered. And this question grows more urgent as we move from the myths themselves to the physical structures that seem to confirm them. Because the architecture does not merely suggest advanced knowledge, it suggests bodies large enough to command the stones. And that brings us to the most unsettling part of Malta's mystery, the part that lies not in legends, but in the physical evidence itself. Most of Malta's temple blocks weigh between 10 and 20 tons. Some approach 50. A few, such as those at Tarxian and Gantija, push beyond what a small prehistoric population could have moved without advanced tools or large numbers. There is no hard evidence of pulleys, cranes, or metal instruments at the time. Timber for sledges or rollers was scarce on an island with limited forests. And even if such materials were available, the logistics required to move these stones would demand far more labour than the estimated population of early Malta could have provided. Archaeologists often compare the movement of these stones to the construction practices used elsewhere in the Neolithic world. Yet these comparisons fall apart under scrutiny. The blocks at Stonehenge, enormous though they are, weigh far less than the heaviest stones on Malta. The slabs at Göbekli Tepe, though ancient, were carved from relatively soft limestone and were erected within a much larger cultural context. Even the great stone spheres of Costa Rica, mysterious as they are, do not match the sheer volume of material moved in Malta. Malta stands alone. The island's builders not only moved massive stones but shaped them with precision. The interior surfaces of many chambers are smoothed with a level of control that suggests advanced planning and consistent technique. The curves inside the temples are not rough or uneven. They show an understanding of geometry and acoustics far ahead of what is expected from a Neolithic community. Several chambers used trilithon doorways, a design that requires balancing large vertical stones with a horizontal lintel. The lintels often weigh several tons. Setting such a block into place at a height above the ground is not a trivial task. It implies scaffolding or lifting methods that go beyond dragging and pushing. Yet evidence for such technology is missing. If wood scaffolding was used, it would have required a quantity of timber Malta could not supply. If earthen ramps were built, they would have left distinct marks that archaeologists have not found. The absence of these traces suggests one of two possibilities. Either the builders used methods we have not yet recognized, or they possessed capabilities that do not fit into the accepted model of Neolithic society. Both explanations challenge the conventional narrative. To understand the scale of the problem, consider Gantija. The name itself means giant's tower, a detail reflecting the long-held belief that the site was not constructed by ordinary humans. Some of its largest stones are longer than a modern bus and thicker than a car. Their weight makes it difficult to imagine how they were quarried, transported, and lifted without advanced tools. And yet they stand in precise arrangement, as though placed by hands accustomed to controlling mass at this scale. Even today, with machinery, such work is enormous. Construction teams would use cranes, hydraulic lifts, and reinforced platforms. To imagine Neolithic farmers performing this level of engineering requires a degree of speculation that modern archaeology rarely acknowledges. The stones do not simply resist explanation, they defy it. The internal rooms of the temples deepen the sense of anomaly. The altars are often positioned at heights better suited to someone considerably taller than average Neolithic individuals. The corridors widen in ways that imply larger bodies moving through them. The distribution of weight suggests the builders understood how to stack and angle stones to relieve pressure and prevent collapse. These are not amateur attempts. They reflect a consistent architectural vocabulary. If these structures represented a culmination of long development, earlier forms would exist somewhere on the island or in surrounding regions. But none have been found. The earlier structures are the most advanced, and later buildings do not maintain the same quality. Instead, architecture becomes simpler, smaller, and less precise, as though the knowledge used to build the temples was lost or no longer relevant to the people who inherited them. This decline raises an essential question. If the early inhabitants of Malta built on this scale, why did later generations not maintain the tradition? Why did the knowledge disappear so completely? Why do the temples appear as though they belong to a culture that had already mastered these techniques before arriving on the island? One explanation is that the builders were not typical Neolithic settlers. Perhaps they represented a group with different physical characteristics or inherited knowledge from an older tradition. If so, later populations may have lacked the capability or the understanding to continue their architectural legacy. What remained would then be interpreted as mysterious, oversized, or impossible. The connection between the size of the stones and the stories of giants becomes harder to ignore in this context. The stones look as if they were meant for people with far greater strength and height than the average human of the time. The oral traditions may not be literal, but they capture a truth embedded in the architecture. The builders were different. They did not work on the same scale as later inhabitants, and their disappearance left behind structures too large to match the world that followed. To understand why such a population might have existed, one must consider a broader prehistoric landscape. After the end of the last ice age, rising seas transformed coastlines. Islands expanded and contracted. Populations moved or vanished. It is possible that Malta once supported communities now lost to the sea, communities with different physiques or technologies. Their architecture might be the only surviving evidence of their presence. This does not confirm the existence of giants, but it does suggest that the physical remains of the builders could contain clues. If a different population truly lived on Malta before the temple culture disappeared, their bones should exist somewhere. The question is whether they have been found, and if so, what became of them. And that question leads directly into the most troubling part of Malta's archaeological history, the part that does not concern stones at all, but the human skeletons that once lay beneath them. If Malta's megalithic temples raise questions about the scale and strength of the builders, the human remains once found beneath those structures raise questions that are even more unsettling. Unlike the stones, which cannot be moved quietly or hidden easily, bones are fragile. They can be misplaced, filed away, reclassified, or quietly removed from view. Over the last century, this is exactly what seems to have happened on Malta. The archaeological record of the early 20th century describes discoveries that no longer exist. Researchers noted skulls that did not conform to the expected morphology of Neolithic populations. These skulls were found in the hypogeum and other temple sites. The descriptions are precise enough to rule out simple misunderstandings. The skulls were elongated in ways not produced by cultural head-binding. Their cranial capacity appeared larger than average. Their jaw structure was unusual. Their proportions did not match known Mediterranean populations. And yet these bones are gone. Reports from the early excavators offer glimpses of what once lay beneath the temples. Photographs existed, but were never widely published. Notes reference dozens of skulls stored in museum collections or research rooms. Some accounts mention elongated skulls arranged carefully in niches, as though placed deliberately. Others describe crania with anatomically distinct features that did not fit comfortably within the framework of Neolithic ancestry. Today, the official line is simple. There are no anomalous skulls. There are no bones that challenge the accepted narrative. Some were lost, some were mislabeled, some never existed. Such explanations might be sufficient if the evidence had been sparse or inconsistent. But the early records are not vague. They are detailed, repeating the same unusual features across different excavations conducted by different teams. The anomalies were recognized even then, though they were often brushed aside as curiosities rather than subjects worthy of deeper investigation. The question is not just why the bones disappeared, but why they disappeared so consistently. One possibility is accidental loss. Museum collections are vulnerable to mismanagement, especially in the early 20th century when cataloguing standards were inconsistent. But accidental loss does not explain why detailed descriptions of anomalous skulls appear across multiple independent reports, all of which correspond to remains no longer accessible. Another possibility is deliberate reclassification. Skulls that do not fit expectations may be labelled as deformed, even when the features described do not match known deformation patterns. Cultural cranial modification leaves distinct markers. The elongated skulls described in Malta do not fit these markers. They appear natural. A third possibility is that the bones were removed from public view because they complicated the developing narrative of Malta's prehistory. As archaeology became more formalized in the 20th century, anomalous finds were often excluded from mainstream interpretation. Theories emphasizing simplicity and linear evolution dominated academic thinking. Anything that challenged the expected timeline or suggested earlier unknown populations was often ignored. But dismissing these skulls comes with a cost. Without them, the story of Malta's earliest people becomes deceptively simple. With them, the story becomes far more complex, hinting at a population that was physically different from later inhabitants. The descriptions of the skulls align in intriguing ways with the oral traditions about giants. The remains are not said to be gigantic, but they are described as robust, elongated, and atypical. A population with such traits would stand out, especially in an isolated island environment. Their disappearance, followed by the arrival of a new group with different physical characteristics, could easily generate stories of giants from a previous age. The missing bones raise another question. If such remains existed, why were they concentrated in places like the hypogeum? Why did the most unusual skulls come from the deepest, most elaborate parts of the underground complex? Why were these areas treated with such care by their builders? The hypogeum is not simply a burial chamber. It is a labyrinth carved with precision, containing levels that descend far beneath the surface. It houses acoustically resonant rooms, hidden alcoves, and passageways that hint at ceremonial or ritual uses. The presence of unusual skulls in this environment suggests that the people interred there were not ordinary members of the community. Perhaps they were revered, perhaps they were feared, or perhaps they were simply different, a remnant of an older lineage that survived for a time alongside newer groups. What makes this mystery even more pronounced is the consistency with which the bones disappear from the historical record. When modern researchers ask to see the anomalous skulls described in early reports, they are told that no such skulls exist. In some cases, they are told that moulds or casts might once have been made, only for those too to have vanished. Absence invites speculation, but the absence here is almost too complete, forming a void where crucial evidence should be. If the skulls were unimportant, there would be no reason for their disappearance. If they were important but inconvenient, their removal becomes easier to understand. The implications extend beyond physical anthropology. If a population with distinctive cranial features once lived on Malta, and if that population was responsible for building the earliest temples, then the island's timeline is not simply missing chapters. It may be missing an entire civilization. Such a possibility reframes every question about Malta's megaliths, the scale of the stones, the abrupt appearance of advanced architecture, the oral traditions of giants. All these elements gain new weight when paired with missing biological evidence. The bones may be gone, but the reports describing them remain. These written traces, combined with the architectural anomalies above ground, push the mystery downward into the limestone depths where Malta's story grows darker and more complicated. Because beneath the temples lies a structure that connects all these threads. A place where many of the missing skulls were first found, a place whose very design defies simple explanations, and it is time to descend into it. The entrance to the hypogeum does not announce itself with grandeur. It is modest, almost ordinary, hidden within the urban fabric of modern Malta, as though the world above has tried to swallow it. But once you step inside, the air changes. The sounds from the street disappear, the temperature drops, and a strange, heavy stillness settles around you, like the slow closing of unseen doors. This is not a natural cave. It is a carved world, a deliberate underworld shaped by human hands for purposes that archaeology has never fully explained. It descends through multiple levels, each one more intricate than the last. The deeper you go, the more the architecture begins to feel like an echo of something older than the island itself. The first level is familiar in its design. It resembles burial chambers found elsewhere in the Mediterranean, though more refined. The ceilings curve with careful precision. The walls bear marks of smoothing tools, not rough chiseling. The layout suggests planning and intention. But even here, the scale feels slightly off, as if the rooms were designed for people taller or broader than those who later inherited the structure. It is only when you descend into the second level that the hypogeum begins to reveal its true nature. The passageways narrow, then widen unexpectedly. Alcoves appear in the walls like silent mouths. Carved pillars rise from the floor to the ceiling in shapes too deliberate to be random, too symbolic to be purely functional. Light behaves strangely in these spaces. Shadows linger longer than they should. Torchlight flickers in ways that make the angles of the rooms feel deeper, sharper, more alive. But it is the third level that changes everything. This level was sealed for decades. Early explorers described it in their notes, but public access has been restricted, and portions of it remain closed even to researchers. Here the air grows heavier still. Sound seems to stretch out, as if the stone is absorbing it and returning it more slowly, like an echo that has learned to breathe. This is where many of the most unusual skulls were found. Early reports speak of niches filled with bones arranged with care. Some were clustered in patterns that do not match ordinary burials. Some chambers feature no remains at all, as though they were not meant for the dead but for the living, or for something in between. The deeper chambers feel less like graves and more like sanctuaries. Their proportions suggest acoustical intention. Their shapes imply knowledge of resonance. These are rooms built not only to be seen, but to be heard. To stand in the deepest chambers is to feel pressure around your ears, a subtle vibration in your chest, a presence that is difficult to describe. It is not fear. It is not awe. It is something more primordial, as if the architecture itself is speaking in a language older than words. The walls bear no inscriptions, but the silence carries meaning. The hypogeum was not built for storage or shelter. It was built for ceremony, for ritual, for communication. But communication with what or with whom remains a question without an answer. There are parts of the third level that appear incomplete, yet even these sections feel purposeful. A corridor begins, then stops abruptly as though cut short by design. A chamber narrows into an opening barely large enough for a single person to enter. These partial structures invite speculation. Were they abandoned, or were they never meant to be finished in the way we understand construction? One chamber stands out above all others. Its walls form perfect curves. Its ceiling dips and rises in a pattern that feels intentional. This room, known now as the Oracle Room, seems to vibrate with the faintest whisper of sound even when no one speaks. Standing inside it produces a sensation of pressure in the head and chest. Some describe it as a hum. Others describe it as a pulse. Researchers later discovered that a voice spoken at a certain pitch resonates powerfully in the stone. But we have not yet reached that part of the story. For now, we remain at the threshold of the underworld, in a place that feels both engineered and ancient. The deeper one goes, the more the space seems to reject the explanations given to it. It does not feel like a simple burial ground. It does not feel like a domestic structure. It feels like something else entirely, something that once served a purpose that modern minds struggle to define. Early explorers described hearing whispers in the lower chambers, though they often dismissed the phenomenon as tricks of the acoustics. Some heard footsteps in adjacent corridors, only to find no one there. A few reported seeing movement in the shadows. These accounts were rarely published in official reports, but they linger in personal letters and journals. Whether these experiences were psychological, acoustical, or something more unusual is impossible to say, but they contribute to the sense that the hypogeum is not just a place. It is an experience. The architecture becomes more enigmatic the longer one studies it. Carved spirals appear in unexpected locations. Openings connect rooms in ways that make little practical sense but seem symbolically intentional. The design reflects a logic that does not match the world above. It is as if the builders belonged to a culture that expressed itself primarily through stone, not through written language. The hypogeum is not just old. It is alien in its purpose, yet unmistakably human in its craftsmanship. It sits at the centre of Malta's greatest mysteries, like a heartbeat beneath the island, pulsing with questions that have persisted for centuries. And at the core of this underworld lies the most perplexing feature of all, a chamber whose acoustics defies simple explanation, a chamber that seems to amplify certain frequencies while swallowing others, a chamber that hints at knowledge far beyond what is attributed to its builders. For in the Oracle Room, the stone speaks. Modern researchers discovered that a male voice speaking at around 110 Hz produces a resonance so powerful it vibrates through the entire complex. It does not simply echo, it pulses. It travels beyond the room, slipping through corridors and chambers, vibrating the air like a low chant. Listeners in adjacent rooms feel the sound move through their bodies. It creates a sensation in the chest and bones, a pressure behind the eyes, a feeling that the space itself is alive. This phenomenon is not an accident. The geometry of the oracle room is too precise, its acoustic properties too deliberate. The curve of the ceiling amplifies specific frequencies. The placement of openings and alcoves alters the direction of sound. Even the thickness of the walls appears intentionally calibrated. Nothing suggests improvisation. Everything suggests design. For a long time, archaeologists assumed the room was used for ritual speech. A man standing at a precise spot in the chamber could project his voice with unusual intensity, creating an atmosphere of authority or sacred power. But this explanation addresses only the effect, not the origin. It does not explain how a Neolithic community could have discovered these acoustic principles, or why they shaped stone with such attention to sonic detail. Acousticians have analysed the chamber with modern equipment. The findings are consistent. The oracle room enhances low male frequencies at a strength that is surprising for its size. The sound patterns bounce and overlap in ways that create oscillations throughout the hypogeum. These oscillations can alter brainwave activity, inducing what some describe as a trance-like or meditative state. Experiments conducted with volunteers showed heightened emotional responses, increased levels of theta brainwave activity, and a sense of presence, as though the space itself were responding. The question is simple but profound. How did the builders know? Some argue that the effect was discovered accidentally. But accident does not sculpt perfect curves. Accident does not produce chamber after chamber with similar properties. And accident does not explain why the resonance is strongest in the deepest level of the hypogeum, far from the living world. Others suggest that the builders experimented with sound through intuitive processes, perhaps through hours of chanting or drumming. But intuition does not create geometric alignments that correspond to acoustic amplification. Intuition does not carve stone with the precision required to generate specific frequencies. The architecture implies knowledge. Knowledge implies transmission. Transmission implies culture. And culture implies time. Yet the archaeological record offers none of these prerequisites. The builders appear suddenly, create structures with advanced acoustic principles, and vanish. This is not the behavior of a society experimenting. It is the behavior of a society remembering. If the hypogeum was a place of ceremony, the oracle room must have been the heart of it. A voice resonating at 110 Hz would have filled the complex like a spirit. The builders may have believed the sound connected them to ancestors, deities, or forces within the earth itself. The resonance might have been used to induce altered states for ritual leaders. It may even have served as a communication tool, carrying messages across the complex. But there is another possibility, one that fits uneasily with the physical evidence of the skulls described in early excavations. If the builders were physically larger than later inhabitants, their voices would naturally produce lower frequencies. The resonance at 110 Hz might have been more than ceremonial. It might have been tailored to the vocal range of the builders themselves. A room that responds most powerfully to a deeper voice suggests that the architects understood not only sound, but their own biological relationship to it. This idea, while speculative, aligns with the structural evidence. The height of the doorways, the proportions of the chambers, the stories of giants, the missing skulls. Together they create a pattern. The oracle room might have been designed not for ordinary humans, but for people whose voices naturally vibrated the walls. Its acoustic properties would have enabled communication or ritual on a scale that is difficult to replicate today. Visitors who enter the room often describe a feeling of being watched, even when alone. Others report hearing faint tones that seem to come from nowhere. These sensations may be explained by the unique acoustics, but they also contribute to the impression that the hypogeum was not simply a structure, but a living system, one that interacted with the people inside it. The fact that the oracle room is so deep underground is also significant. In many ancient cultures, caves and subterranean chambers served as gateways to the underworld. Sound behaves differently in these spaces, creating echoes that blur the line between the natural and the supernatural. The builders of the hypogeum may have chosen the depths because they believed the earth itself amplified their voices. They may have thought they were speaking to the world below or to beings who dwelled there. The acoustic phenomenon has drawn comparisons to practices in other ancient sites. Some temples in the Levant and Anatolia show traces of intentional sound design, but none resemble the precision of the oracle room, nor do they sit within a structure as vast or as deliberately subterranean. The hypogeum remains unique. One cannot help but wonder what it sounded like when it was used as intended. A deep voice calling out in a darkness lit only by fire. The stone responding with tremors that ran through the walls. The participants standing in silence as the resonance washed over them. The effect would have been overwhelming, transformative, unforgettable. For the builders, this may not have been a performance. It may have been communication. Sound might have been the medium through which they expressed their relationship to the hidden world beneath the island. And in the passages beyond the oracle room, there are accounts of something else. Accounts that speak of movement in the shadows. Figures watching from deeper corridors. Observers who vanished when approached. Stories dismissed or buried, yet they persist in the testimony of the earliest explorers. Because in the darkness beyond the reach of the oracle room, something was seen. Among the many mysteries surrounding the hypogeum, none has endured with more persistence or more discomfort than the report filed by a civil servant named Lois Jessup. Her experience did not take place in some forgotten era of myth. It occurred in the 20th century, in a time of records, institutions, and official oversight. Yet what she claimed to have seen has remained on the edge of recognition, neither fully accepted nor effectively dismissed. Jessup visited the hypogeum as part of her administrative duties in Malta. She had no special training in archaeology. She was not inclined toward the mystical. She entered the underground complex with the same curiosity as any visitor, expecting to observe an ancient site preserved for study. But she left with a memory that would follow her for the rest of her life, a memory that she later wrote down with a clarity that does not resemble imagination. The story begins in one of the deeper rooms of the hypogeum. Her guide showed her a narrow opening high in the wall, a passage that was no longer accessible. Accounts vary on whether the opening was natural or artificially carved. What is consistent is that the chamber beyond it was not listed on modern maps and was not part of the tour. Jessup asked if she could climb up to the opening to look inside. Her guide hesitated but ultimately agreed. She climbed with some difficulty, eventually positioning herself at the lip of the passage. It was dark, and she could see little. She called back to ask if anyone had a light. The guide handed her a flashlight. With the beam in her hand, Jessup aimed it into the darkness. That is when she saw them. She described the figures as tall, standing upright in a chamber beyond the opening. There were several of them, though she could not say how many with certainty. They were motionless at first, silhouettes against an even deeper darkness. Their proportions struck her immediately. They seemed elongated, taller than any humans she had seen. Their limbs appeared long, their posture calm but alert, as if they were aware of her presence even before the light reached them. For a moment she thought they might be statues, remnants of a ritual space. But then they moved, slowly, deliberately, not toward her, but in response to the beam of light. As the flashlight swept across them, the figures shifted slightly, not startled, but acknowledging. It was this movement that convinced her she was looking at living beings. Jessup felt neither fear nor panic. Instead, she reported a strange sense of quiet, as though the figures and the space itself were part of a world that did not recognize the concerns of the surface. She watched them for a few seconds, unable to speak. Then one of the figures lifted an arm briefly, not in greeting, but in what seemed like a gesture of awareness. The moment was brief but unmistakable. She climbed down immediately, shaken but controlled. When she told her guide what she had seen, his reaction was not disbelief. It was concern. His face tightened, his voice lowered. He asked her to describe the figures again, but he did not dismiss her. Instead, he seemed to want to end the conversation. He urged her to leave the area and refused to let her climb again. Later, when she asked other staff at the site about what she had witnessed, responses varied. Some claimed ignorance, some deflected. One, according to her notes, said quietly that she had seen what others had seen before her, but none agreed to speak on record. The passage she looked into was sealed shortly after her report. Today, there is no access to it. On modern maps, the chamber is not listed. It has vanished from official diagrams. The reason given is safety. The rock is unstable, the passage dangerous, but the timing of its closure has led many to wonder whether instability was the true concern. Jessup's testimony was later investigated by independent researchers. They found her account consistent, her language precise, her demeanour calm. She did not embellish the story in later years. She did not seek attention. She simply recorded what she had seen and allowed the record to stand. Critics have offered several explanations. Some say she misinterpreted shadows. Others suggest hallucination induced by the acoustics or the oppressive atmosphere. But her description of the figures, their height and their controlled movement, does not fit the profile of illusion. Nor does the unease displayed by the guide, whose reaction suggests that her sighting was not unprecedented. The idea of living beings moving in the sealed chambers below Malta stretches the limits of acceptability, yet the hypogeum is an environment where the normal boundaries of expectation do not apply. Its acoustics distort sound. Its layout confuses the senses. Its depths remain incompletely mapped. Many areas have been closed for decades. We do not know what lies behind every wall or where every corridor once led. If Jessup truly saw living figures, the implications are profound. They may have been researchers or workers in a restricted area. They may have been misperceived shapes or shadows. Or they may have been something else entirely, something that challenges assumptions about Malta's past. But the most compelling possibility lies between these extremes. If a different population once lived on Malta, a population with larger bodies and deeper voices, then perhaps remnants of that lineage survived longer than expected. Perhaps they withdrew into the deeper passages as the world above changed. Perhaps the hypogeum was not only a ceremonial space, but a refuge. Whatever the truth, Jessup's account has never been fully erased. It exists in the margins of Malta's history, a reminder that the darkness beneath the island once held more than bones. And the story does not end there, because the chamber she looked into was not the only part of the hypogeum that vanished. Entire corridors, rooms and passageways once visible in early maps no longer appear in modern diagrams. Some were sealed, some were buried, some were simply left out. And this change in the map of the underworld is where the mystery deepens even further. To understand how deeply Malta's underworld has been reshaped by time and by human decision, one must look not at the stones themselves, but at the maps. The earliest diagrams of the hypogeum, drawn by archaeologists and engineers in the early 20th century, show a structure far more expansive and labyrinthine than the version presented today. These maps contain corridors now absent, chambers no longer accessible, and lines that once led downward into areas marked simply as unknown. Comparing these early documents with modern representations reveals a story as unsettling as any physical discovery. Whole sections have vanished. Staircases once noted as leading to lower levels end abruptly in current diagrams. Rooms described in excavation journals are not shown on the maps now given to researchers. The changes are not minor corrections. They redefine the shape of the entire subterranean complex. The first set of maps comes from the period when the hypogeum was initially uncovered and explored. These were the days of lanterns and handwritten notes, when archaeologists crawled through narrow passages with no guarantee of stability. They documented what they found, line by line, chamber by chamber. Their sketches reveal branching corridors that extend beyond what visitors see today. They depict side passages that turn sharply, only to open into larger spaces. They show levels deeper than any now acknowledged. Some of these early maps were published. Others remained archived in institutional collections. But taken together, they paint a picture of a hypogeum that once reached farther into the bedrock than the official narrative allows. As the 20th century progressed, these older maps were gradually replaced by newer versions. The later diagrams maintained the general layout, but omitted many of the deeper or narrower sections. Some omissions were explained as safety measures. Others were justified as refinements, corrections of earlier inaccuracies, but not all the changes were rationalized in print. Some simply appeared in the updated diagrams without any note as to why the earlier features had been removed. The most curious discrepancies involve passages described as unstable, but which earlier explorers had traversed safely. These were sealed, sometimes with stone, sometimes with concrete. The justification was safety, yet the pattern of sealing suggests something more deliberate. The sealed areas correspond in several cases with the locations where early archaeologists found the unusual skulls. They also align with the parts of the hypogeum that acoustically link to the oracle room, areas where resonance might have been strongest. Maps created by third-party researchers who had access to the site during periods of renovation confirm that some sealed spaces are still physically present behind the newer walls. In some cases, sound tests reveal hollow spaces where no room is officially recorded. A tap on the stone produces a different echo. A thermal scan reveals voids. These voids correspond to areas shown on the earliest maps but erased in later versions. The sealing of these areas raises obvious questions. Were the passages closed because they were dangerous? Or were they closed because they led to discoveries that complicated the island's official history? In the years following the initial excavation, stories circulated among workers and guides about chambers that were deeper than the ones allowed on tours. Some spoke of a fourth level, though no official documentation supports its existence. Others hinted that the complex connected to natural caves or even to older man-made tunnels predating the hypogeum itself. None of these claims can be proven, but the inconsistencies in the maps make them difficult to dismiss entirely. The disappearance of certain mapped areas also coincides with unexplained events recorded unofficially by museum staff. Reports mention visitors hearing sounds from sealed chambers, including rhythmic tapping or faint voices. Some workers describe the sensation of airflow from behind blocked passages as if the underground world continued beyond the visible boundaries. One guide claimed that a sealed door once rattled slightly, though this story is anecdotal and cannot be verified. These accounts gain significance when placed alongside the changes to the maps. Each removed corridor represents not only a physical absence but a conceptual one. What was once an intricate network is now presented as a simpler structure, reduced to a shape that is easier to understand and easier to explain. The complexity of the original layout, with its unexpected turns and irregular depths, suggested a purpose that was not purely ceremonial. The simplified version supports a narrative of burial and ritual, stripping away the parts that raise uncomfortable questions. The timing of the map revisions also aligns with a shift in archaeological interpretation. As the field became more formalized in the mid-20th century, the desire for orderly narratives grew. Malta's prehistory was streamlined. The idea of a unique or anomalous builder population was downplayed. The hypogeum was reclassified as a communal tomb, and the maps began to reflect these interpretations, losing the features that contradicted them. In this sense, the maps became more than tools of navigation. They became instruments of narrative control. The sealed corridors represent more than stone. They represent the boundaries of accepted history. They define what we are allowed to see and what we are not. They shape not only the physical understanding of the hypogeum, but the intellectual one. If the deeper passages still exist, hidden behind layers of concrete and modern interpretation, they may contain clues to the questions raised by Malta's earliest structures. They may hold evidence of a population that predated the Neolithic settlers. They may preserve the remains of rituals conducted in the presence of sound and shadow. Or they may simply reveal the natural evolution of a complex that was modified over centuries. But until these sealed areas are opened, the truth remains inaccessible. Yet the story of missing corridors is not the only disappearance associated with the hypogeum. There is another event, whispered more than recorded, that took place decades ago. An event that left families searching, authorities scrambling, and many believing that the deepest parts of the hypogeum hold dangers far beyond unstable stone. It is a story that pushes the mystery from the archaeological into the human and into the tragic. Because in the early 20th century, according to accounts passed through generations, a group of children walked into the hypogeum, and not all of them came back. The story begins with a school outing, sometime in the late 1920s or early 1930s. The exact date varies depending on who tells it, but the core narrative remains unchanged. A group of children, accompanied by teachers and possibly a few local volunteers, visited the hypogeum as part of an educational excursion. At the time, access to the lower chambers was less restricted than it is today. Visitors could enter areas now considered too unstable or too sensitive for public viewing. According to the accounts, the children descended into the deeper levels with their guides. They moved through the upper rooms, examined carvings, and listened to explanations about ancient Malta. Nothing unusual occurred until they reached one of the lower passages. Here the group split slightly as the children moved more quickly than the adults. The corridors were dimly lit. Shadows shifted in the flickering light of lanterns. The air felt heavier, cooler. Some children wandered ahead, turning into a narrow passage that branched off from the main path. Teachers called out for them to stay close, but the echoes made it difficult to tell which direction the voices carried. Within moments, several children had moved out of sight. When the adults rounded the corner, they found the passage empty. At first, the teachers assumed the children had gone a few meters farther, but as they called out, the responses did not come. They advanced deeper into the corridor, expecting to find the children in the next chamber. The next chamber was empty. Another corridor led off to the right, but it too was silent. They continued searching, voices growing louder, more frantic. Still nothing. Panic set in. A teacher ran back to alert others. Guides rushed to join the search. The group split up, shouting the children's names into the darkness. Some reported hearing faint sounds, a distant echo that resembled crying. Others claimed to hear footsteps far below, in places no map showed. Hours passed, the search expanded. Workers were summoned, then police. Families began to gather at the entrance. The hypogeum filled with noise and confusion, a stark contrast to the silence that normally defined its chambers. Yet as the searchers moved through the labyrinth, they found no sign of the missing children. The corridors seemed to swallow sound. The deeper they went, the less the echoes returned. According to some accounts, a few searchers reported hearing voices drifting upward from a sealed portion of the complex, as if the children had somehow found their way into a lower, uncharted level. But the source of the sounds could not be located, and when they attempted to break through one of the blocked passages, the authorities intervened, citing the risk of collapse. The blocked area was never opened. The official story recorded later was brief and incomplete. In some versions, all children were eventually found. In others, the incident never happened at all. But residents in nearby neighbourhoods tell a different story, one passed through generations with a sense of grief and unresolved fear. They speak of families who received no clear answers, of children who never returned home, and of an investigation that ended abruptly. One persistent detail appears in several retellings. Some searchers claimed that the crying they heard gradually faded, as though moving deeper and deeper underground. The sound was described not as screaming, but as frightened, confused weeping. In one version, a guide said the voices sounded as if they were being carried away by something unseen, drawing them farther into the darkness. In the aftermath, access to the lower levels was restricted. Certain passages were sealed shortly after, officially due to structural instability. Maps were revised, tours were limited to safer areas, and the story of the missing children was relegated to rumour, an uncomfortable tale that officials dismissed but locals refused to forget. It is easy to view this account as myth, a dark story shaped by fear of the unknown. But the consistency across independent tellers raises unsettling questions. Why did so many details align? Why did different families in different decades speak of a similar incident? Why were portions of the hypogeum sealed soon afterward? The environment itself invites speculation. The acoustics can confuse direction. The narrow passages disorient even experienced explorers. In such a place, a child could easily become lost. But the scale of the disappearance and the failure to recover any trace pushes the incident beyond the boundaries of a simple accident. The context is equally troubling. This was a time when the hypogeum was still being mapped and understood. Some chambers had not yet been explored. Others were unstable or partially collapsed. And beneath it all lies the possibility that the ancient builders created passages that are still undiscovered, hidden behind centuries of debris and layers of new interpretation. If such passages exist, they may lead into depths that are far beyond the reach of modern tours. There is another possibility, one rarely spoken but lingering beneath the surface of every retelling. If a different population once lived in the deeper parts of the hypogeum, even long ago, could some remnant have remained isolated? Could the children have followed a sound, a shadow, or an echo into a place where others once lived? This idea is speculative, yet it connects with the accounts from earlier explorers who heard footsteps, saw movement, or sensed presence in unexplored areas. It connects with the testimony of Jessup, who reported tall figures beyond a passage now sealed. It connects with the sealed corridors, the missing bones, and the acoustic properties that suggest the hypogeum was more than a ceremonial tomb. Whatever truth lies behind the story of the missing children, it stands at the intersection of fear, mystery, and the unknown. It marks the point where Malta's underground history becomes more than an archaeological puzzle. It becomes human, tragic, and deeply disturbing. And it leads to a question that cannot be ignored. If the physical evidence that once explained Malta's mysteries has disappeared alongside its deeper corridors, what else has been removed from the record? Because the next chapter of this story does not concern myths or accidents. It concerns the deliberate decisions of the modern world to reshape the past. Early excavators described skulls that did not match standard Neolithic anatomy, maps that showed deeper corridors than modern diagrams, and chambers that contained structures too refined for the populations known to have lived on the island. But as archaeology professionalized, these anomalies were reclassified, reports were rewritten, collections were reorganized. By the mid-century, the more troubling details had faded from official accounts, surviving only in old notes, letters, and unpublished manuscripts. The disappearance of physical evidence was not always intentional. Some losses were the result of poor storage or wartime disruptions. The island endured significant upheaval during the Second World War. Museums were damaged, records were misplaced, artifacts were moved for safekeeping and then forgotten. Yet the pattern of what disappeared suggests more than chance. The remains that went missing were often the ones that challenged the prevailing view of Maltese prehistory. For academics in the early to mid-20th century, the idea that Malta's earliest builders might not fit neatly into the Neolithic template presented an uncomfortable proposition. It implied a discontinuity in human development. It suggested the existence of a population that did not leave a genetic or cultural trace in later communities. It hinted at timelines older or more complex than textbooks allowed. Such implications were not welcome. Archaeology at the time was invested in a vision of human progress that moved in clear, predictable steps. Cultures evolved gradually, not suddenly. Knowledge accumulated slowly, not in leaps. Populations did not appear advanced and then vanish without explanation. And so evidence that contradicted this vision was inconvenient. Inconvenient evidence rarely survives. One of the strongest pressures came from the need to present Malta as part of the broader Mediterranean narrative. The island needed a place in the established timeline. It needed to fit. And so the megalithic structures were labelled as ceremonial architecture, built by Neolithic farmers using simple tools and remarkable ingenuity. This interpretation was not malicious. It was, in the eyes of the institutions, reasonable. But it required that all contradictory data be smoothed over or removed. Skulls that did not conform to expectations became mislabeled or lost. Maps with deeper levels were revised. Theories involving earlier or different populations were dismissed as speculation, and the hypogeum was reframed not as a mysterious underworld, but as a communal burial site, simplified for clarity. This process was not unique to Malta. Across the world, early archaeologists uncovered anomalies that defied easy classification. These anomalies often vanished in later decades as institutions sought to streamline their narratives. In North America, reports of unusually tall skeletons found in mounds were eventually dismissed or lost. In Peru, elongated skulls that did not fit the known deformation patterns were marginalized. In Anatolia, pre-pottery architecture that complicated the understood evolution of civilization was reinterpreted conservatively. Malta's story fits within this global pattern, yet it also stands apart. The island's small size and isolated environment should have preserved physical evidence more reliably. The fact that crucial remains disappeared anyway suggests an even stronger narrative pressure at work. Institutional caution played a major role. Museums were hesitant to display artifacts that could attract sensationalism. Academic journals were reluctant to publish findings that could be associated with fringe theories. And so results that fell outside conventional explanations were excluded not because they were disproven, but because they were disruptive. Over time, this created an illusion of certainty. The public came to believe that Malta's prehistoric story was stable and fully understood. Students were taught that the island's temples were built by a straightforward Neolithic culture with no unusual characteristics. Visitors were shown curated routes through the hypogeum that avoided controversial areas. And the notion that earlier generations might have encountered a population with distinct physical traits faded from memory. Yet fragments of the old narrative survived. Archaeologists who worked on the earliest excavations left behind letters describing skulls they found puzzling. Engineers sketched diagrams of chambers deeper than the official maps. Tour guides whispered of areas that were sealed, not because they were unstable, but because they led to places that were not meant to be explored. These fragments persisted like pressure beneath a sealed chamber, waiting for the weight above them to shift. The modern era has reopened some of these questions. New technologies allow for more precise analysis of stone and soil. Ground-penetrating sensors can detect voids behind walls. Acoustic mapping can trace the resonance of hidden chambers, and although official institutions have not acknowledged deeper levels or unusual remains, the tools of contemporary research continue to reveal inconsistencies in the accepted narrative. It is possible that one day the sealed passages of the hypogeum will be explored again. It is possible that lost artifacts will resurface in archives, and it is possible that Malta's earliest history will be rewritten in a way that embraces complexity rather than smoothing it away. But until that day comes, the story remains fragmented. Evidence that once existed is gone or inaccessible. Records that once revealed depth are now viewed as outdated, and the image of Malta's past presented today is one shaped as much by what was removed as by what remains. Yet even after a century of revision, some traces still lie beneath the surface. Untouched, waiting. The stones above and below ground whisper the same quiet contradiction. The architecture does not match the narrative. The narrative does not match the people. And the people do not match the physical traces that once existed. If much has been erased, then what remains is even more important. And to understand what still lies beneath Malta, we must look not at what has disappeared, but at what the island has refused to let go. Beneath all the revisions, sealed corridors, and missing records, the hypogeum still holds one undeniable truth: the structure itself remains. The stone does not lie. It does not lose its memory. It does not bend to the narratives placed upon it. Deep within its chambers, beyond the reach of curated tours and academic summaries, the limestone continues to tell a story older than any official explanation. The remaining evidence reveals itself not as a single discovery, but as a collection of consistencies, small but persistent, that survive every attempt to simplify the past. Taken alone, each piece seems intriguing but not extraordinary. Together they form the outline of a lost history that the island has never fully surrendered. One of the first clues lies in the unfinished sections of the hypogeum. Far from being a sign of abandonment, these areas show a level of precision that suggests intentional design. Carved walls suddenly taper into narrow openings, as if meant to restrict entry. Some rooms appear partially shaped, not because the work was abandoned, but because the space achieved exactly what the builders intended. The geometry stops not in chaos, but in purpose. These unfinished spaces also exhibit acoustic traits similar to the completed chambers. Even without smoothing, the stone resonates when struck. This resonance indicates that the builders understood how sound travelled through limestone. It was not a discovery made at the end of construction, it was embedded into the design from the very beginning. Another clue emerges from the small alcoves carved throughout the complex. They are placed at varying heights and depths, not uniformly distributed like storage spaces or niches for ordinary offerings. Researchers who have studied the layout note that many alcoves correspond to points of acoustic reflection. A voice projected from certain positions in the hypogeum produces an echo that aligns perfectly with the alcove pattern, as though the builders intentionally shaped the walls to manipulate sound. These alcoves may have acted as directional amplifiers or as markers for ceremonial participants. They may have been used to cast shadows or hold lights during rituals. Their placement suggests a knowledge of both sound and sight, a blending of sensory design rarely seen in Neolithic architecture. Another surviving detail, one rarely mentioned in official tours, is the presence of carved spirals near the deeper levels. These spirals appear in locations where visitors today are not normally allowed. Early explorers described them in their notes, but modern cleaning and restoration efforts have left some of these carvings faint or eroded. Despite this, the pattern is unmistakable. The spirals are not decorative filler. They appear to mark transitions between levels, shifts between acoustic zones, or boundaries between different ceremonial spaces. Spirals are among the oldest and most universal symbols found in prehistoric art. They often represent cycles, portals, or movement between worlds. In the context of the hypogeum, they may signify entry into the symbolic underworld, or the crossing from ordinary space into ritual space. Their presence supports the idea that the builders possessed a symbolic system not seen elsewhere on the island. One of the most powerful forms of remaining evidence is something that cannot be sealed, revised, or easily dismissed: the weight of the structure itself. The sheer size of the chambers, carved entirely by hand, demonstrates a level of labour organisation that contradicts the assumption of a small, simple Neolithic society. Some rooms required the removal of hundreds of tons of stone. The logistics of such work demand either a large workforce or a population far stronger and more capable than expected. In addition to the physical features, there is the curious consistency of airflow within the complex. Even in sealed or restricted areas, subtle drafts move through the chambers. The air does not stagnate, it circulates. This suggests the existence of unseen passages or natural ventilation channels integrated into the original design. Modern researchers have detected airflow patterns that do not match the visible map, implying that the hypogeum extends farther than officially recognized. There are also temperature variations between certain chambers. Areas close to the known map remain cool, but deeper sections exhibit surprisingly stable temperatures, as if connected to larger subterranean cavities or spaces capable of buffering heat changes. These inconsistencies hint at hidden architecture or natural voids that the builders incorporated into their construction. And then there is the whisper phenomenon, reported by both early explorers and modern staff. In certain chambers, soft murmurs seem to drift from unseen spaces. They are not clear words but tonal sounds, as if echoing from distant rooms. Acousticians attribute this to resonance patterns travelling through stone, but the sensation remains unnerving. The whispers always seem to come from slightly deeper than the known passageways, reinforcing the idea that unseen chambers still exist. What remains beneath Malta, then, is not a single secret, but an entire framework of unanswered questions. The hypogeum reveals the fragments of a story that was never fully written down, preserved only in stone and silence. The consistent anomalies align with the earliest and most controversial discoveries: the missing skulls, the oversized architecture, the tall figures reported by Jessup, the sealed tunnels, the lost maps. All threads point downward, toward the possibility that the hypogeum we see today is only the visible surface of a larger system. Perhaps there are deeper chambers still sealed or collapsed. Perhaps the builders accessed caves long since closed by time, earthquakes, or later construction. Perhaps the earliest culture of Malta operated in a subterranean world far more complex than we imagine. These possibilities gather at the edge of Malta's accepted history, forming a boundary between what is known and what is withheld. The hypogeum remains the strongest argument that the island's first builders understood things their successors did not: sound, geometry, psychology, and perhaps something even older, a memory carried from a time before the Neolithic arrived. Whatever the truth, the hypogeum stands as the last remaining witness to a forgotten culture. Not everything has been erased. Not everything has been sealed. Stone remembers what paper forgets, and as long as the hypogeum stands beneath Malta, the possibility of deeper knowledge remains alive. But Malta's mystery does not stand alone. To understand the full scale of this forgotten chapter, we must step beyond the island and look outward, across oceans and continents, to other places where impossible architecture appears suddenly, fully formed, at the dawn of civilization. Because Malta is not an exception, it is part of a pattern. When we step back from the island of Malta, something remarkable becomes clear. The mysteries that rise from its temples and echo through its underground chambers are not isolated anomalies. They form part of a larger pattern, a global thread woven through the earliest chapters of human history. It is a pattern of sudden architectural mastery, unexplained disappearances, symbolic continuity, and technological leaps that appear fully formed, only to fade without explanation. Across the world, the first monumental structures emerge not at the end of long developmental chains, but at their beginning. At Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, stone circles with intricate pillars appear 12,000 years ago, with no known precursor sites to explain their sophistication. At Teotihuacan in Mexico, the earliest construction phases of the city show engineering precision unmatched by later occupants. In the Andean highlands, the oldest megaliths fit together with a perfection that later cultures could not replicate. In Egypt, the earliest pyramids exhibit a level of precision that eroded over time, not the other way around. These sites share a simple, uncomfortable truth. The oldest structures are the most advanced. Malta joins this pattern with striking clarity. Its earliest temples, including the hypogeum, are the most complex, the most acoustically refined, and the most technologically demanding. Later structures are simpler, less exact, more conventional. This reversal of expected development points to a cultural inheritance rather than a cultural evolution. It suggests that the earliest builders possessed knowledge or traditions that later populations did not fully understand. It is here that Malta's mystery gains context. The missing skulls, the sealed tunnels, the tall figures described by Lois Jessup, the vanished corridors, the anomalous acoustics, the oversized stones, all these fragments echo similar stories from around the world. In Peru, elongated skulls with unusual cranial features are found in cemeteries associated with early megalithic builders. In parts of the Pacific, oral histories describe tall, powerful people who built stone structures before disappearing into the sea. In North America, mound builders left behind skeletons that early excavators described as unusually tall, only for those remains to vanish into museum basements or private collections. In ancient Sumer, the earliest kings were said to have reigned for impossibly long lifespans, as if descended from a different lineage. In each case, the pattern is the same. The earliest phase of civilization contains signs of a people who appear suddenly, build monuments beyond the capabilities of later cultures, and then vanish, leaving behind structures that later societies adopt but do not replicate. Malta sits at the center of this pattern not because it is the largest or the most dramatic example, but because it is one of the most self-contained. Its temples, corridors, chambers, bones, and myths are all preserved within a single island. It is a closed system, a microcosm of the larger global puzzle. And when viewed through this lens, the anomalies no longer seem random. They become part of a shared inheritance from a forgotten world. Some researchers propose that these early builders were survivors of an older civilization destroyed at the end of the last ice age, displaced by floods, climate shifts, or geological upheaval. These survivors may have brought with them traditions, knowledge, and architectural practices that later populations treated as sacred or divine. Over generations, as their descendants integrated with local groups or grew isolated, their unique traits faded, leaving behind only the architecture that once defined them. In this view, the hypogeum becomes more than a burial site. It becomes a remnant of an older lineage, a cultural echo from an age erased by time. The unusual skulls described in early excavations may not have belonged to mythical giants, but to the last remnants of a once distinct population. Their disappearance from museum records becomes not only an archaeological loss, but a dismissal of a chapter that does not fit comfortably into the accepted timeline. The sound design of the oracle room, the spirals cut into the stone, the hidden corridors, and the precision of the megaliths may be remnants of knowledge carried from a world before the Neolithic, a world that passed through catastrophe and survived only in fragments. This idea, once dismissed as fringe speculation, gains credibility when the evidence is assembled across continents. The pattern persists. The anomalies repeat. The oldest structures are the most refined. The earliest populations show traits that later groups do not possess. And everywhere the narrative of linear, gradual development falters. Perhaps the first chapters of human civilization were not simple. Perhaps they were complex, interconnected, and far older than we imagine. Perhaps Malta is not the beginning of this story, but one of its final echoes. When we look at the island today, we see a landscape shaped by time and sea. We see temples rising from worn limestone. We see a modern society built atop an ancient one. But beneath it all lies the memory of a world that came before, preserved in stone and silence. The hypogeum stands as the last guardian of this memory, a gateway into a realm where sound, shadow, and geometry converge into something uniquely ancient. If deeper chambers still lie hidden, they may hold the final pieces of this global puzzle. If sealed tunnels still exist, they may contain the remnants of rituals or architecture that could rewrite our understanding of the past. If forgotten maps, records, or bones resurface, they may reveal that Malta's earliest builders were part of a civilization far older and more advanced than the world has yet accepted. For now, the story remains incomplete. But every discovery, every comparison, every anomaly brings us closer to understanding the truth. Malta is not an isolated mystery. It is one node in a vast ancient network, a network that stretches back to a time when humanity may not have been alone, and when the world's first great monuments were built not by beginners, but by the last survivors of a forgotten age. And if this is true, then the story of Malta is not just about the past. It is a message, a reminder carved in stone, a whisper from the deep earth, a warning that the first civilization was not the last, and that some truths lie not above the ground, but beneath it. If you found this journey into Malta's forgotten underworld as fascinating as we did, consider liking the video, sharing it with someone who loves ancient mysteries, and subscribing for the next chapter in this series. Your support keeps these stories alive, and it helps forgotten worlds rise again. Wherever you are watching from tonight, I hope you rest well. Good night.